In this video, we're going to be taking a closer look at water. First, we're going to learn what determines where water is found and how water behaves in both biological organisms as well as in environmental systems. Then we'll learn a little bit about how organisms cope with variations in water availability. Now, water is incredibly important for biological organisms. For one thing, it is what all biochemical reactions occurs within. So chemicals will dissolve in water because of its unique properties, and this allows chemical interactions to occur within water. Also, some of the major biochemical reactions that allow for life, things like photosynthesis and cell respiration, either require water as an input or have water as an output, and typically require water at some point along the biochemical pathway. The major thing that allows water to be involved in so many different biologically important processes is that water is sticky. Water has charges. It has positive and negative charges on it, which allow it to stick to itself, but also to stick to other things. And we call things that are sticking to water solutes, and they do what's called dissolve in water. And you've probably experienced this at some point in your life if you've ever put salt into water or tried to dissolve cream in your coffee, or basically did almost anything in terms of cooking. You've used the dissolving properties of water. Because water is so important, it's also very abundant in organisms, and organisms tend to contain between 60% and 90% of their body mass in water. This is why when we're looking for evidence of life on other planets, such as looking for potential life on Mars, one of the things we look for is the presence of water, and we're trying to find out if there has been or is water on other planets. And that allows us to get an understanding of whether life could be similar to what we have here on Earth. So the first thing when understanding the impact of water on organisms for us to understand is to have an idea of what determines water availability. Now, water will flow among energy gradients. It's going to go from areas of high potential energy to areas of low potential energy. But there are several different factors that have an influence on how water is going to move around. Something called gravitational potential, something called pressure or turgor potential, another term called osmotic potential, and then finally a term called matric potential. We're going to go through each of these terms individually in this video and talk about what they mean. And then we're going to conclude by talking about how organisms will change their physiology, biology, behavior in order to survive these different water environments. So the first one is gravitational potential. This is a fairly straightforward concept, is that water flows downhill. So this is most prevalent on slopes, so rain comes down in precipitation or rain high up on a slope, and water will flow either over land or deep in groundwater from higher elevations to lower elevations, and will tend to then pool together in areas like rivers, and you'll get things like runoff. So this is not a huge surprise. You may have experienced this if you've ever poured water down a hill, used a slip and slide, for instance, things like that. Water tends to flow downhill. So areas high up have a harder time finding water sometimes because water is flowing away from them rather than towards them. Okay. In addition to gravitational potential flowing downhill, water is also subject to something called pressure or turgor potential, and this means that water will move from areas where it's under higher pressure to an area where it's under lower pressure. And the most common example of this is something called evaporation. This is where water will transition from a liquid, where it's much more compact, to gaseous state, where it's much less dense. So water in a liquid state is more dense, water in a gaseous state is less dense, and water is going to move just simply because there's lower pressure in that gaseous state. So this will happen fairly slowly at low temperatures and will happen more quickly at higher temperatures because those higher temperatures will allow water to break that connection between water molecules, that stickiness between water molecules. But it will happen ultimately anyway. So if you have a pot of water and you just leave it sit, over time that water is going to evaporate, is going to leave the pot and enter the air. And you can definitely experience this. If you left a pot of water out overnight, there'd be less water in that pot in the morning. Now, there's a lot of things that impact this evaporation and the speed of evaporation. First thing we said is temperature. So if you heat the water, it's going to evaporate more rapidly. So if you boil the water, for instance, you're going to get water converting into steam much more rapidly. But it also is impacted by water vapor in the air. So the more water there is already in the air, the slower this happens as well. So in areas with high humidity, you're going to get lower evaporation. In areas with low humidity, so very dry environments, you're going to get higher evaporation. So you may notice this if you try to cool your body through sweating, which is called evaporative cooling. This happens very well in dry climates. So if you go to an area like Arizona where it's fairly dry, when you sweat, it's a very effective way of cooling your body. Or if you were to go down to Louisiana or Florida, areas where it tends to be hot and humid, your sweating does not tend to cool you very well because it's not able to have as rapid evaporation. And it's not able to, those molecules of water are not leaving the surface of your body as fast. So evaporation is water transitioning to a gaseous state, and it's impacted by temperature. It's also impacted by how much water is already in the air. Okay. A third thing, and a very important thing, and this is a concept that we will come back to in class and explore in a little more depth, is something called osmotic potential. And this is water moving because of things dissolved in it. So it moves from a region where it has high concentration of water and low concentration of things dissolved in it to a region where it has a lower concentration of water with higher solute dissolved in it. Now, this is a very difficult concept, osmotic potential, so we will explore this more in class when we can actually do some activities to delve into this problem a little bit more detail, but I'll give you a basic overview of osmosis. So osmosis, we tend to relate this to salt concentration, but it could be concentration of really anything that's dissolved in water. Now, concentration of salts will vary dramatically, and salt concentration in water, such as fresh water versus salt water, has a large impact on organisms that are living in that environment due to this osmotic potential. And this is why. So water with high concentration of things dissolved in it, so high salt concentration or high concentration of anything else that's dissolved in it, has a lower concentration of water. So water is more concentrated in a freshwater environment than it is in the oceans, for instance. And because of this, water will move from an area where it's highly concentrated to an area where it's lower concentration through a process called osmosis. So what we see is that water moves from freshwater environments into ocean environments. Again, this is a difficult concept. We'll cover this in more detail in class. Some terms we will go into in class are these terms related to something called osmolarity, which is a measure of how much stuff is dissolved inside of the liquid in an organism. And it's a relative measure. So you're comparing two sides of, say, a membrane of a cell. If the two sides of the membrane have the same concentration of solute, we call them isoosmotic. So they have the same concentration. And when you're isoosmotic, when you have the same solute concentration, there's no movement of water from one side to the other. Well, the water will move, but you don't have any net movement of water. Oftentimes, however, we're dealing with a situation where we have a higher solute concentration, so more dissolved substance on one side than the other, in which case one side is going to have a higher solute concentration or be hyperosmotic, and the other side is going to have a lower solute concentration or be hypoosmotic, HYPO osmotic. Water is going to move from the side with a lower solute concentration, therefore higher free water concentration, to the side that is hyperosmotic, so higher solute or lower free water concentration. So water moves from an area that is hypoosmotic into an area that is hyperosmotic. So what this means is that water moves from the, say, freshwater side into the side that has more dissolved solutes. So this has an impact on organisms living in an aquatic environment. So things like fish or amphibians, or even you when you go swimming in an aquatic environment like the ocean or a pond. Now, first let's look at organisms living in freshwater. So a freshwater fish is living in an environment that has fairly low concentration of solute. And so the fish is going to be hyperosmotic or have a higher concentration of things like salts and other dissolved molecules than their environment. They have more in their cells than in the environment they're swimming in. Therefore, because water always moves from hypoosmotic to hyperosmotic, water is going to flow into the fish's cells. So the fish is going to have to deal with this by, one, getting rid of as much water as possible. So freshwater fish are constantly eliminating water. They have very, very dilute urine, and pretty much as they swim around, they are peeing constantly. They produce about 30% of their body weight per day in urine, which is an incredible amount for a small organism like a fish. Frogs also will do the same thing. They're going to be absorbing water through their skin, and they're going to produce a whole bunch of urine. Now, we will talk in class about other ways that freshwater fish deal with their osmotic imbalance. So they do things like they don't drink, they consume salts to try to get extra salts because they're losing some of them in their urine, and they will be actively, again, getting rid of water. Marine organisms, on the other hand, have the opposite problem. So marine fish tend to be hypoosmotic, so they have a lower concentration than the environment they're in. They're in salt water. So they're actually losing their body water to their environment as they swim around. So what they're going to have to do is they're going to actually have to drink water. So they're constantly drinking water, but that water, again, contains salts in it, and those can be harmful to their metabolic processes. So they're going to be having to excrete some of those salts back out into the ocean. So they have mechanisms which they can excrete excess salts, but they are constantly drinking seawater. In contrast to freshwater fish, marine fish don't pee very much. They have very low amounts of water loss in urine, so they have very concentrated urine that itself contains a lot of salts. So they're constantly excreting excess salts, and they're constantly actively pulling water into their bodies, which is direct opposite to what you would find in a freshwater fish. Again, we're going to cover osmosis in much more detail when we get to this in class time. The final potential energy that controls water movement is something called matric potential. Now, this is a concept that's a little hard to explain, but essentially it's the fact that water tends to stick to things, which means that water will stick to surfaces of large molecules, either inside an organism, but also on the surface of soil particles. So one way we could describe this is to look at plant water availability. When there's tons of water in the soil, it might be fairly easy for plants to get access to it, but as that water level decreases, it reaches a point where it's hard for the plants to get access to the water, even though the water might be in the soil, because that water is sticking to the soil particles. So because water is sticky, the plant has to be able to pull it off of the soil surface. So water will tend to stick to things, and that's what's called matric potential, and that's simply due to the charge on a water molecule. So again, gravitational potential, pressure potential, osmotic potential, and matric potential determine how water flows in an environment. Okay. So water is important. Water availability is determined by various forces that are acting on the water. How does this then impact organisms? Well, organisms, especially terrestrial organisms, have to be able to get access to gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide, depending on what metabolic processes they're doing. And they have to do this in a dry environment. As those gases are entering and exiting the organism, they can lead to evaporative water loss. So organisms in a terrestrial environment have to minimize their evaporative water loss. So some organisms will do this through skin resistance. So humans have fairly waterproof skin. We don't lose very much water across our skin. Or they could do this simply by living in environments where they don't have to worry about water loss because they have ready access to it. And so this determines what body types are most successful in different environments. Some organisms are going to be very successful in moist environments, but not very successful in dry environments, and other organisms are going to do better in dry environments because they have adaptations that allow them to resist water loss. So I want to just look at two classes of organisms, organisms that do very well in wet environments but not so well in dry environments, and then organisms that can do better in dry environments, and look at why they might be this way. So amphibians, like frogs here, have to live in moist habitats. And the reason for this is that their skin is essentially a big lung. They absorb a lot of oxygen across their skin membranes. Their lungs, they do have lungs, but their lungs are not very efficient at gas exchange, and therefore they need to supplement this with absorption through their skin. Because they're absorbing gases across their skin, they have to keep those skin moist, and they're very subject to evaporative water loss. So they have to live in moist environments. Now, we will find some frogs in drier habitats, and even there are desert frogs, but they're always located near a reliable water source. So they might have a pond, a stream, they have some source of water that's nearby that allows them to have ready access to that water to replenish water as it's lost through evaporation. Now, we do get organisms that can live fairly far away from water, such as reptiles, and they're successful because they have waterproof skin. They do not have gas exchange across their skin. Instead, they have internal gas exchange through lungs, and those that allows them to have layers of dead cells or coatings or plates or scales that prevent them from losing water. Mammals and birds have an additional layer of skin, of fur or feathers, which also help to prevent water loss. Now, because of this, they have difficulty cooling their body through evaporation. And so many mammals have sweat glands, which allow them to lose water on purpose to allow for evaporative cooling, but also to control this. So if you are losing too much water, you will actually stop sweating. And so that's actually a sign that you are stressed, very stressed. If you stop sweating but are still hot, you probably need access to water immediately. So you are running short on water supply. So organisms are able to survive being in drier environments if they have internal gas exchange in lungs, which protects that surface from drying out too quickly, and also by then making their skins less porous to water. Arthropods, so things like beetles and scorpions, have some of the highest resistance to water loss, and this is because they excrete on the outside of their body something called an exoskeleton made of a carbohydrate called chitin, and a waxy coating on the outside of that exoskeleton that is impervious to water, and so they do not lose water really at all across their skin, across their outer part of their body. And so they can be very resistant to water. So again, just to kind of summarize where we've gone, we looked at several different factors that influence water availability, so where water is found. We've also looked very, very quickly at what different factors organisms have that help them prevent excessive water loss. Now we're going to explore this question of water availability in much more detail in class. We'll do that, but we'll stop here for now.